Senate Concurrent Resolution 202, recognizing and honoring Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. for his service to the United States during World War II.
Whereas Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. was born on November 26, 1911, to Sabas Ramirez and Cecilia Laruya, and whereas Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. grew up in Agu, La Union, Philippines, along with his 8 siblings, and whereas in the early 1930s, Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr., at 18 years of age, decided to immigrate to the United States with his cousins Rosendo and Henry. And whereas Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. and his cousins worked as farmers near Sacramento, California, and whereas Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. also worked as a busser for a local restaurant, and whereas after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. and his cousin Rosendo enlisted in the U.S. Army, and whereas Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. served in the 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment, initially at Camp Beale near Sacramento, and whereas Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. was deployed to New Guinea and southern Luzon, Philippines, specializing as a cook, and whereas Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. served in the military forces commanded by General Douglas MacArthur upon his return to the Philippines in 1944, and whereas Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. served in the U.S. Army with honor and distinction for 3.5 years, and whereas Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. received numerous medals and accommodations for his wartime leadership and service, including the Bronze Star, World War II Victory Medal, Philippine Liberation Medal, Good Conduct Medal, Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, and American Campaign Medal. And whereas Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. met Labrada, the love of his life, at a party during his deployment to the Philippines, and they were married shortly thereafter on May 14, 1945, in Angeles City, Pampanga, Philippines. And whereas in the late 1945, Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. had to return to the United States when his deployment ended, and whereas while they were separated, Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. sent Labrada weekly love letters. Whereas February 1946, Paul Labrada Ramirez and their first child had their first child, Lydia, and they had 10 more children together: Paul, Danilo, Elizabeth, Maria Vicky, Alex, Jose, Bernard, Fidel, Crisanta, and Andy. And whereas after the war ended, Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. returned to the Philippines to live with his family. And whereas during his life in the Philippines, Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. was a fisherman, a carpenter, and owner of a sari-sari sundry store. And whereas due to his community involvement and leadership, Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. was elected as Capitan del Barrio, a neighborhood leader. And whereas Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. received U.S. citizenship due to his military service, which also distinguished his children as U.S. citizens and allowed them to immigrate to the United States. And whereas because Labrada's sister was already an inhabitant of Portland, Oregon, many members of Paul and Labrada Ramirez's family settled in Northeast Portland. And whereas all of Paul and Labrada Ramirez children were ultimately able to settle in the Pacific Northwest, and there now are more than 70 descendants of Paul and Labrada Ramirez living in Portland metropolitan area. And whereas U.S. Senator Ron Wyden saluted the bravery and sacrifices of Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. during World War II, and whereas Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. was honored with the Congressional Gold Medal, which hangs in the National Museum of American History, reminding visitors for generations to come of his remarkable wartime service. And whereas the Consulate General of the Republic of the Philippines in San Francisco stated that the Philippines' independence in 1946 was made possible by the bravery of Mr. Ramirez and our other World War II veterans. We owe a debt of gratitude to him and our veterans for the freedoms that both countries enjoy today, he stated. And whereas the Consulate General further stated that the legacy of Paul Laruya Ramirez Sr. serves as an example for generations to come to learn about how ordinary individuals can be called upon to do extraordinary things. He represents the best of the Filipino nation, and his heroism shall forever be remembered and honored. Colleagues, SCR 202 honors Mr. Ramirez's life and his service, and I respectfully urge your support. Thank you.